Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. It's great to see you today on this cold and blustery day. Today we'll talk about the Great Transition. Did you know that we're in the midst of a great transition? We're at the starting line of something new. Well, we're starting to see the acceleration of history, where 50 years of change are getting compressed into a decade. With energy, you can see glimpses of this great transition looking around the world, whether it's in South Australia, where now wind-generated electricity is greater than coal-generated electricity. And even if the coal itself were free, solar power would still be cheaper. In the 100+ cities worldwide that are now getting over 70% of their electricity from renewable energy. Or look at Spain, where wind power is closing in on nuclear generation. Or in China, where wind-generated electricity is already greater than nuclear-generated electricity. In the UK, wind-generated electricity is eclipsing coal on some days, and after 115 years of burning coal, Scotland just recently burned its last lump of coal as it moves forward in this transition. So each month we're seeing new renewable energy records set, and it's exciting to think about. You know, we know energy transitions themselves are not new. How many people got here by a horse and buggy? Or are these lights powered from whale oil? Certainly not. But this energy transition is happening in our lifetimes, and it's incredibly exciting. So before we get into the nitty-gritty on energy, why don't we talk a little bit about why we care, why we're interested in this. And we can start with some small talk. How about we talk about the weather? Well, today is one of the coldest days of the year. We're hearing about this meandering polar vortex, whereas the Arctic is warming up and the jet stream is getting a little bit wavier. Colder air is slipping down into the continental United States. Whereas meanwhile, in Australia, they're having record high temperatures, and you can talk to kindergartners in Australia now who do not know rain because there's been a drought their entire lifetimes. In the US, of course, we've had our own recent experience with drought and wildfires on the West Coast. And overall, at the global level, we know that the 11 warmest years on record have all come since 2005. And this is because carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are rising at unprecedented rates, largely from burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, also the destruction of our forests. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, climate change affects us in many different ways. Most intimately, perhaps, is with our food supply. So you look at this ear of corn. We're all familiar with corn. Many of us eat it, enjoy it on the summer. We eat quite a bit of corn. If you have a typical American refrigerator that you open up and you see your milk, eggs, maybe some hamburger, all those are embodied corn. Now what has to happen for this corn to grow? Well, each one of those kernels is attached to those tassels you see, and grains of pollen have to fall down, make their way down to the tassel, every single one to produce each of those little kernels of corn. So that's great when you have good temperatures and lots of water. It's easy to get juicy, plump ears of corn. But in years of drought, those tassels shrivel and corn pollination can fall to zero. Now you may say, well, I don't eat very much corn, and that may be true, but these same challenges of high temperatures and pollination shortfalls happen with all the major grains that are feeding much of humanity, corn, wheat, and rice. If you look around the world and you see how well we're doing at growing crops, our yields of crops, how much you can get for every given acre. Since World War II and throughout this green revolution, we've seen crop yields in many parts of the world start to increase for a number of reasons. New varieties, where you can grow plants closer and closer together. But in many parts of the world, the growth in yield is slowing. So this shows us Japan and China. Now, Japan has some of the most experience of anybody in growing rice. They probably do it. They have some of the best rice farmers in the world, but they're not making much more progress in getting more rice per given acre. Now, China, which you know, the most populous country in the world, is nearing Japanese levels in yields. And you can see this if you look around the world with wheat in Europe's major producers who are hitting that yield ceiling. It's sort of like a biophysical limit where you look at runners, you know, nobody's talking about the next 3-minute miler. There's some limits in the system. Other ways we're seeing the effects of climate change are with the melting of ice in the ice caps and ice floating in the seas. Now, when sea ice melts, that doesn't directly raise sea level because that ice is already floating. But when Greenland or the West Antarctic ice sheet start to melt, that additional water can raise sea level. And projections are showing that by the end of this century, sea level could rise on the order of 1 meter or more, 3 feet or more. That means inundation in coastal cities already. Parts of the United States even are seeing these regular nuisance floods. On sunny days in Miami, you may see streets start to get flooded as the seas are higher already because warmer water expands. Ice is also melting in the world's mountains. We can call these our reservoirs in the sky. Mountain glaciers are melting throughout the world. Now, in the short term, that increases the flows of rivers and can cause a boom in food production. But in the long term, as those reservoirs in the sky disappear, that means that if you're depending on river flow to irrigate your crops, you're going to be in trouble. Meanwhile, apart from climate change, we are over-pumping our underground water supplies. So you can see in satellite images, this is showing us Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia used their oil well drilling technology to drill down deep into the desert to reach these fossil aquifers, fossil stores of water, and subsidized wheat production in the desert for many years. Until around 2009, when the government said, we're going to phase out these subsidies. We're running out of this water underneath our desert. And so we're going to stop subsidizing wheat production, stop growing food in the desert, and thus you have a country of about 30-some million people turning to the world market for the major part of their food supply. Now, Saudi Arabia is a relatively small country, but if you look throughout the Middle East, we have about the equivalent of a Nile River worth of water flowing into the country in terms of grain imports. So what happens as we are overpumping our water supplies in other parts of the world? The world's 3 major food producers, the United States, India, and China, are all seeing water tables fall because of overpumping in some of their agricultural areas. In India, every single state now is seeing water tables fall in some areas because of overpumping. In the United States, it's the Ogallala Aquifer in the central United States where farmers now are abandoning some of their areas in northern Texas, parts of Kansas, because they cannot drill deep enough to get that water table, that water. Though these water sources, some water underground is replenished regularly with water, but these fossil aquifers, they're just like an oil field, and once that water is gone, you're in trouble. So looking around the world, we see overpumping happening in at least 18 countries with over 3 billion people, maybe even close to 4 billion people dependent on water that's being overpumped. This is like, you remember the housing bubble or the stock market bubble? This is the food bubble. We can produce a lot of food now, but as we're using up our water supplies, the base of that production is being depleted. So water you drink is a very small part of our water consumption. It's when you look at the water used to produce food, it gets interesting. So just a few fun facts. You need about 8 glasses of water to produce just 9 leaves of spinach. If you want 3.5 walnuts today, you better have 7 gallons of water to produce it. A bunch of California grapes requires 24 gallons of water to produce. Or 4 glasses of milk require 143 gallons of water. That's because those cows, most of them are fed grain, and it takes about 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of grain. So when you start looking at meat, milk, eggs, you're looking at a lot of water use. So if you decide to eat that mere portion, 1.75 ounces of beef, you'll need 86 some gallons of water to produce it. The water demands of food are enormous. At the same time, in about 1/3 of the world's major land areas, soil erosion is exceeding soil production. A few years back, we saw a report coming out of China called Desert Mergers and Acquisitions, as deserts in the northern part of the country are actually expanding and becoming larger and larger, and that's because of overplowing, overgrazing. You see roads can disappear, telephone poles, you'll have to attach one on top of the other as the sand dunes are moving and you want to have your power line stretch over it. And soil, of course, as we know, is the basis for our lives. Right now we have 7.5 billion people on the planet. So with current population growth rates, that means there's about 226,000 new diners at the global dinner table each night. So put all these things together, a storm is brewing. We have this tightening food supply while global demand is rising. Put on top of this the stress of climate change, and you can see humanity needs to make changes very quickly. It's not an exaggeration to say the fate of civilization is at stake. But what if, as our problems grow, so does our ingenuity? And for this, we can look at some historical examples. My longtime colleague and mentor, Lester Brown, he talks about the World War II style mobilization as a historical precedent for rapid change. What can happen when a society puts its mind to do something, to work together to achieve a goal? We see that we can make rapid change, not in decades, not in years, but in a matter of months. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was on December 7th, 1941. 1 month later, in his addressing the United States, President Roosevelt laid forth his arms production goals. He said, "We will produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 6 million tons of merchant shipping." These were numbers no one could have comprehended before. It was hard to imagine such enormous goals, but it didn't stop there. American ingenuity got put into play and turned toy factories into compass manufacturers. Instead of making spark plugs, the industry churned out machine guns. From early 1942 to 1944, Essentially, no cars were produced because all of that manufacturing capacity got put toward the war effort. Now, today, the major stresses are not foreign powers, and we don't need such violent means to get ourselves out of it. There are ways to put together our common interests and solve our problems. We can do it. We can look around the world and see pieces of the puzzle everywhere. A lot of it are things that are common sense, very simple. Empowering women, educating children, particularly girls, teaching them how to read, giving them the tools and information so that they can control the sizes of their family. If you want an example of a country that's dramatically been able to reduce its population growth rate, you can look at Iran. Iran was able to reduce birth rates from some of the highest in the world to close to levels in the United States in a very rapid period of time, and they did so largely by educating girls. The Muslim clerics were on board. They taught classes to couples before they got married, teaching them about contraception. And they were able to make rapid change. With tree planting, one of the solutions we need, you can look to examples like South Korea that had become largely deforested. But after experiencing the problems associated with deforestation, like flooding, landslides, the country began to realize the wealth that you get from natural resources, that you get from your forests. And they were able to blanket hillsides with trees. And now you look at satellite images and you can see very sharply the line between North Korea and South Korea, because South Korea is largely green. With soils, you can look at what the United States was able to do in the years stopping the Dust Bowl. Instead of overplowing and overusing our land, farmers learned how to respect the contours of the land and put in tree buffers and other things to stabilize soils. So this can be done. So the other part of the puzzle, we'll go back to this great transition, back to renewable energy, because it's a big part of the picture. Scientists are telling us now if we want to stabilize climate, we will have to leave a lot of our fossil fuel resources in the ground. We'll have to leave about 80% of the coal there, 50% of the oil, a third of our natural gas, in order to stabilize climate back to stable levels. Here we have good news. The fastest forms of energy growth worldwide right now are our renewables. Solar growth is outpacing almost everything else, growing recently at 132% per year. That's dramatic doubling rates. Wind is also growing biomass, but they're starting from a relatively small base. So if you look globally, you can see we still use an awful lot of coal, but renewable energy is starting to rise. And so the challenge is to accelerate the downturn of the fossil fuels and the upturn of the renewables. So to drill down on this, we can look at what's happening with coal. In the United States, despite recent attempts by the government to, the administration to intervene into markets and prop up the coal industry, Wall Street, utilities, other investors are turning away from coal. Coal use in the United States peaked in about 2007 and has fallen about 37% in the years since. There's a number of reasons for this. Part of it is lower natural gas prices, the effects of air pollution regulations, local campaigns. And it happened pretty quickly because in the late 2000s, the US Department of Energy put out a report talking about the coal-fired renaissance. But since then, plant after plant has been shuttered. or is planning to close. Right now, of the 530 coal-fired power plants in the United States, over half have recently closed down or plan to close. This is a number that changes pretty quickly. If you want to keep tabs on what's happening with coal-fired power plants, you can check out the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, where they have a countdown that I have to check every time I talk to someone because the number of coal plants retiring keeps going up. Other countries have passed peak coal. Australia, Canada, many countries in the European Union have also passed peak coal. So that brings us to the question, what is happening in places like China? China now burns more coal than the rest of the world combined. And you can see what effect it has on China's air quality. The Chinese government actually has an official statistical data set they gather on blue sky days. They have to count the number of days each year where residents of the various cities actually see blue skies. A set of researchers actually did an interesting experiment in China, and they looked at northern Chinese lifespans compared with southern Chinese lifespans. Now, why were they doing this? Well, in northern China, where it's very cold, coal consumption was subsidized by the government. So accounting for all sorts of other factors that could make a difference in lifespan, the researchers found that because of the higher coal burning in northern China, people were living 5 years less than in southern China. Currently, Beijing is taking this air pollution, this quality of life difference, very seriously. And so we have to ask the question, has China passed peak coal? Coal use has fallen in the last couple years. It's gone up just a bit in the last year, but we may have passed peak coal in China, and this is big news for the climate. China's done so because when the Chinese government sets out a goal to do something, it's able to do it pretty fast, and China's set forth enormously large goals in wind and solar, and China now leads the world in both wind and solar production. China is building some additional nuclear power plants, but as we can see, nuclear is not seeing a bright future. If anyone recognizes this picture, we're looking at in Fukushima, Japan, the aftermath of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that led to a meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear reactor. Thus far, the numbers are still coming in, but it looks like it'll cost the government hundreds of billions of dollars, depending on the levels of water contamination that they're seeing. There's still some 35,000 people that have not moved back home. And shortly after the disaster, the Japanese government actually raised the allowable level of nuclear radiation that people can live with for health, to try to coax people to come back. But even before the Fukushima disaster in 2011, we saw a number of countries, and indeed the world, peak in its nuclear electricity generation. So there's currently about 417 nuclear reactors worldwide. Not a huge number when you think about it. That's down from about 438 that were operating in 2002. A number of countries have already passed this peak. France peaked with its nuclear generation in about 2005, which is interesting because France is one of the countries that has a large reliance on nuclear power, but the government set forth a goal to reduce its reliance on nuclear energy from about 75% of its electrical production to about 50% by 2025. And it accompanied this with some ambitious goals for new wind power generation. Even South Korea, that is currently building some of the world's nuclear power plants under construction, they have a long-term shutdown goal. And a large reason for this is that the nuclear fleet is aging. So in this graph, the top part of the graph is showing when nuclear reactors came online. So you can see we're well past the heyday of nuclear. So that means we have an aging fleet. Many of the world's nuclear power plants are near 40 years old, which is the amount of time most of them were rated for their lifetime. The United States recently shut down its oldest reactor, a 49-year-old plant in Oyster Creek, New Jersey. There's currently only 2 reactors under construction in the United States after, in 2017, the Sumner Company pulled a plug on 2 of its plants it was constructing in South Carolina. The company had already spent $9 billion, but construction costs kept going up and up and up, and so they ended up canceling. After spending $9 billion, abandoned. Nuclear power is costly from cradle to grave. Decommissioning costs are incredibly high as well, and most of those costs aren't calculated into the cost of new production. So we saw in 2017, Toshiba Westinghouse, which is historically the largest builder of nuclear power plants, it filed for bankruptcy production in the United States. Interestingly, it ended up being bought by a company that has no experience in the nuclear sector, but it is specialized in the takeover of companies having difficulties, which might make you worry a little bit if you're in the nuclear industry. In China, which many people look to and say, well, they're a nuclear energy power. Wind-generated electricity has actually eclipsed nuclear-generated electricity. And this is not just capacity, this is actual generation of wind turbines versus nuclear power plants. And it's possible that we'll see that gap widen in the future because China has an enormous goal of 200 gigawatts of wind power capacity by 2020. They've historically been ahead of achieving their goals with renewable energy. And a group of researchers, including some scientists from China and from Harvard University, found that wind could meet the power needs of most of the top 10 carbon emitters. The world wind power potential is 10 times its current electricity demand. Sometimes with wind turbines you hear about the NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. Well, in much of the United States, in farming and ranching country, it's the opposite. It's the PIMBY, put it in my backyard. Farmers and ranchers are saying, put that wind turbine on my land because they know they can generate far more cash from the royalties of producing energy from wind than they could from grazing cattle or growing crops. In effect, they're double cropping that land because they can continue to raise their cattle and grow their crops, but also have a constant stream of income. So currently, Iowa and South Dakota now generate over 25% of their electricity from the wind. In Texas, if Texas were a country, it would be number 6 in the world for wind production. Other parts of the world where wind is growing strong, Denmark, we talked about getting over 40% of its electricity. And the reasons for this is wind, it's abundant, it's widespread, it's scalable, it's increasingly cheap. Once you build that infrastructure, your fuel is free. And that's one of the reasons why you see this enormous growth curve in wind. Solar shares many of those same attributes of wind with an added attribute that it has no moving parts. You can put up solar panels, these are photovoltaics or PV, on rooftops or on marginal land, be producing the energy that you are using just right above your head. Solar is, as we looked at earlier, it's growing incredibly quickly. China had major goals for solar power generation. It said it was going to produce 20 gigawatts from photovoltaic panels by 2020, except it surpassed that goal too early, so it raised it to 50 gigawatts, and it surpassed that, so now its goal is 100 gigawatts by 120. India also has similar goals, and in one of the interesting ironies of this great transition, Coal India, which is the world's largest coal producer, Coal India has installed solar panels on some of its facilities to cut energy costs. So it's sort of like atonement for their past energy sins or something like that. Solar can be the photovoltaic cells we looked at. There's other ways to use the sun's energy, concentrating solar power. This takes a fair bit of land, but in areas where you have it, you can use mirrors to concentrate the sun's power and basically turn a steam engine, or turn an engine, turn a generator. And the exciting thing about solar thermal is that you can use it to heat up molten salts that can stay hot and continue to produce energy through the night. So for as much as 18 or more hours, you can continue to produce solar energy. So even after the sun goes down, this technology allows that. You can also use solar to heat water in homes. In China, one of the solar water entrepreneurs spread word of the technology by going village to village and saying, does anybody have an egg? He would ask for an egg. They'd bring him one. He'd put it in one of these solar hot water collectors. The egg would be boiled in a matter of minutes. And so people said, yes, I will take one of those. They were relatively cheap. In some villages, it was people who never had hot water before. In other places, they're even on apartments, heating water with the sun instead of fossil energy. In other parts of the world, they're used in Israel. Over 85% of the homes are heating their water with solar energy. In Argentina, the president's rooftop has solar water heaters. And in Brazil, there was a social program that was mandating putting these solar water heaters on new buildings for the poorest people. So in China, there's enough of these to supply over 170 million households with hot water. They can also be used for space heating or other things. You can revise urban building codes to mandate the use of solar thermal energy and heat pumps and very efficiently heat your houses. So the exciting thing about solar is it can be used for those villagers in China. It can work for Apple. This is a big solar farm in Maiden, North Carolina. But it works around the world. It works for big companies. It works for villages. In China, where villagers could switch from using kerosene to produce light at night, switch from kerosene to one solar panel, one light bulb, whether it's LED or compact fluorescent light, and a cell phone to charge a cell phone, villagers end up actually saving money. The system pays itself back within a matter of 3 years. The World Bank has a program in Bangladesh where they're putting tens of thousands of solar photovoltaic systems on people's roofs per year, so it can spread incredibly fast. So wind and solar are the big forms of renewable energy, but we also have things like geothermal, tapping the energy of the earth. Geothermal energy can be used both directly for heating water in space. It can also be used indirectly to produce power, like in this facility. A lot of the geothermal energy capacity is not as widespread as wind or solar, where you can use it almost anywhere. But in the so-called ring of fire around the Pacific, like the US West Coast, Japan, Indonesia, New Zealand, some of the Pacific Islands, and in the African Rift Valley, there's quite a big geothermal potential. Actually, after Fukushima in Japan, people said, why aren't we using geothermal energy instead of nuclear energy? Iceland is a major user of geothermal energy. About 30% of their electricity comes from geothermal, and about 90% of space heating in Iceland is energy from the earth. And there's other direct uses of geothermal, like you can use it to heat fish farms or greenhouses. Even in Iceland, they run the pipes under the sidewalks, and you can use it for melting snow without having to burn any fossil fuels. So you can see the United States actually is a geothermal leader, although most of us wouldn't know it. But other countries with much larger potential are like in Indonesia. Indonesia, Pertamina, which was the state-run oil company when Indonesia was producing much more oil, it's now investing heavily in geothermal, looking to produce 100,000 megawatts or 100 gigawatts by 2025. The Philippines has ambitious goals. Japan, as I mentioned, could meet about half its electricity needs with geothermal energy. So in parts of the world, it can be pretty big business. In fact, there's 24 countries that could meet 100% of their electricity demand just from this energy from the earth. We also have hydropower. Hydropower is pretty interesting. There can be big dams like this, or there can be small run-of-the-river systems. World hydro generation is growing. It's been supplying about 16% of the global electricity demand for many years. But by and large, the era of building big dams is coming to a close. These projects are not only expensive, we've pretty much dammed most of the rivers that are available. There are in Asia in particular and on the Congo River, looking at some new projects, but most of the big projects are done, and for the environment, that's probably good news. But hydropower we still have a fair bit of untapped potential. So we looked around the world, there's about 45,000 or so large dams. So of those 45,000 large dams, only 8,600 are actually generating electricity. So even without building any new dams, we could be getting a fair bit more hydropower. And hydropower is exciting because it's constant in most places, as long as you don't have major droughts. So you have to plan carefully. But by and large, river flows are fairly predictable, and there can be good baseload power. You can also use hydropower to pump water uphill, say your solar plants or when your wind turbines are spinning. You can use that energy, pump water uphill and then have it flow back down when maybe the wind is lulling. So altogether, no country will meet all of its energy needs from one renewable energy source, but if you put together lots of the pieces, you can have a fully reliable electricity system without having to burn any fossil fuels. One thing that's making it easier to meet our renewable and our demands with more and more renewable energies is that we can use energy more wisely. When we save energy, we save money. Efficiency measures in 11 industrial countries since the 1970s save about $740 billion in just 1 year because of those efficiency improvements. We're highlighting Japan's Top Runner program. It's an interesting program. It looks on the market and says, what's the most efficient refrigerator or computer or light bulb or vacuum cleaner or washing machine? And it says, okay, that's the most efficient one. That's the new standard. So they keep ratcheting up improvement and can use energy more wisely. So that's why we look to Japanese products when we want something that is efficient. It's because the government has put those standards on and really incentivize continuous improvement. Other ways to save energy are with lighting. The shift away from incandescent light bulbs is well underway, and part of that is because of government policies. So we've calculated if the world shifted from the least efficient to not even the most efficient, just moderately efficient, say from shifting from an incandescent bulb to a compact fluorescent, that would allow for the closure of 270 coal-fired power plants around the world. If you shifted to something even more efficient like LED lighting, even better, and you could close more coal-fired power plants. And save people money, and as the technologies are getting better, it provides them with a good source of lighting, and cities are finding it actually saves in labor costs because the newer, more efficient forms of lighting last much longer, so you don't need to have crews changing your street lamps regularly because you can install a light bulb that might last a decade. So if we couple all this improvement in efficiency and renewable energy with our current automotive economy and switch and electrify transportation, we can make big gains. Currently, you can drive an electric car on about the equivalent of 80 cents per gallon of gasoline. Electric vehicles are about 4 to 5 times more efficient than internal combustion energy, and every major automaker now is working on electric vehicles. The bank UBS did a study, and they found that in Europe, where gasoline costs are a little higher, if you purchase an electric car plus a set of solar panels to charge it, plus storage for that energy, that purchase could pay itself back in 8 years because of the saved fuel costs. And then after that 8-year payback point, you're basically running your car for free. Putting more electric vehicles into the grid is actually exciting too as a storage component, because you can have electricity basically flowing in different directions, allowing for a more robust grid system. Oh, and just to highlight the costs that have fallen. So I put solar panels on my house in Washington, D.C. back in about 2009. Now, since then, the cost of the panels have fallen by about 3/4, but it still was a good purchase because I've paid a lot less in my electricity bills. So the costs of these technologies are falling incredibly quickly. Since 2010, solar costs down 73%, wind down over 23%, and battery costs, they're a few years behind solar and wind costs falling, but battery costs are falling quickly. And I think that will be the big game changer in electrifying transportation schemes around the world. So a lot is happening. Historically, these changes in energy have been policy-driven. I think going forward, we're looking at them being market-driven. It is the falling costs now. When there's open auctions for power purchases, we're finding that solar and wind are increasingly undercutting other sources of energy. So they're wise economic decisions. Things are happening quickly, but still we need to accelerate them. These falling costs are a major accelerator. The policies are important. But still we're playing in an uneven playing field. Fossil fuels are still subsidized around the world at least twice as much, if not more, than renewable energy. There's at least $600 billion of government subsidies around the world going to fossil fuels. And so how can we balance this playing field, and why is it important to do so? Well, a fun quote from Øystein Dali, the former vice president of Exxon for Norway and the North Sea. He said, socialism collapsed because it did not allow the market to tell the economic truth. Capitalism may collapse because it does not allow the market to tell the ecological truth. Capitalism may collapse because it does not allow the market to tell the ecological truth. So what does this mean? Well, when we fill up our car with gasoline, we're not paying the full price of that gallon of gasoline. We're not paying for military posts to protect oil and gas assets, or these new technologies that have allowed for oil and gas renaissance in the United States. The damage from horizontal drilling and fracking. We're not paying for the air pollution costs of burning that gallon of gasoline, with children and the elderly getting sick with asthma. We're not paying for the reduced crop yields or the melting ice caps in the glaciers, acidification in the ocean. We're not paying for these changes that are taking the climate zone out of the realm that any human civilization has ever known. So one way to help balance this playing field is to put a price on carbon. So instead of allowing the atmosphere to be treated as an open sewer for our carbon emissions, we can pay for the privilege to put those carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And a growing number of governments around the world, realizing the predicament that civilization is in, they're starting to do that. They're putting a price on carbon. This map from the World Bank shows some of the places around the world that have or will soon enact prices on carbon emissions in various forms. Altogether, it represents at least 14.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a good first step, and these aren't all small countries. We have China on that list. So how does it work? Well, you can put a price on carbon either at the wellhead or the use, basically a fee on each ton of carbon dioxide emitted. There's different ways to do it. You could make it revenue neutral, for instance, offset the tax on carbon by reductions in taxes on income or on labor, or you can disperse part of the money back to the public. Studies have looked at this, and they found that most people in America, in this country, would be far better off if there was a carbon tax and some of that money returned to the people, because most of us don't have 3 houses and 6 cars. We're not using that much energy. There is precedent. In British Columbia, the government set, in Canada, they have for the whole province an economy-wide carbon tax that they put in place in 2008. And in a relatively short time, in just a few years, per person consumption of gasoline fell by 15%, but the British Columbia economy kept pace with all the other provinces. So these are exciting. You know, it's kind of wonky to talk about carbon pricing, but in a simple way, you could say, you know, thinking about tax shifting, you could say tax what you burn, not what you earn. These are costs that need to be paid. And as the price of burning fossil fuels goes up, the transition can happen much more quickly. There's other movements that are helping to accelerate this transition. One of them, you may have heard of the Divestment Movement. A lot of it started by a group called 350.org, Bill McKibben's group, and colleges and university students around the country saying, wait a minute, why is our university's endowment, why is there so much fossil fuel investment when these institutions should be thinking about our future. So a number of institutions, over 1,000 actually, with $8 trillion in funds have divested from coal or from all fossil fuels. They've pulled their money out of that. And the interesting thing is, for these institutions, it's actually been a great financial move, because I don't know if anybody's looked at coal stocks recently. They haven't been doing that well. So it's a prudent move from a financial perspective. It's a prudent move from a civilizational perspective. And some of these divestors are ones that originally got their money from fossil fuels, like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They were Standard Petroleum. Other groups divesting include the World Council of Churches, the Guardian Media Group, Norway. They have their $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund they've divested. Of course, a lot of that money came from oil in the North Sea. So it's an interesting shift over. California state government is selling off its coal stocks because the California State Pension Fund lost $5 billion in 1 year because of their fossil fuel holdings. So they said, okay, I think it's time to pull out of coal. New York City is another investor, and yeah, New York City is also suing some of the major oil companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, others, for the damage caused by climate change. And Paris and other cities are looking at suing these oil companies for the same reason. So movements are happening. There's people taking to the streets to say climate change is important. Climate change is something that governments need to pay attention to. We need to leave some of these fossil fuels in the ground to protect our future. But businesses, it's not just the protesters, it's the businesses too. This is a rooftop of a Walmart. Walmart has almost 300 solar photovoltaic systems on its US buildings. And the former CEO of Walmart, Bill Simon, said in 2014, he said, this is a business decision. The renewable energy we buy meets or beats prices from the grid. So he wasn't doing it, it's good for the company's image, but they're doing it to save money. A number of other large companies have been making power purchase agreements to produce renewable energy, and they're doing so because they can have a guaranteed low price of energy for the future. Like one of the early ones was Apple. They had a 25-year contract with First Solar to supply their California operations. Large investment groups like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs are channeling tens of billions of dollars into renewable energy. If you look at what some of the world's billionaires are doing, they're betting pretty big on renewables. Warren Buffett had invested $15 billion in solar and wind before early 2014 and said, there's another $15 billion ready to go. So these aren't altruistic environmental decisions necessarily, they're business decisions. And so this is one of the reasons we have hope. And when we can actually see the transition in place, this is one of the more visible manifestations. This was an abandoned oil field in California, oil and gas field. And Google bought it and installed a solar farm right on top of that where they weren't producing any more oil and gas. Google buys a staggering amount of solar and wind to power its servers and other things. The company's aiming for 100% renewable energy, and when these places are looking to build new facilities or set up new shops, they're saying, well, we may come to your community, but what kind of renewable energy are you going to be able to give us? There's over 600 entities in the United States that now generate or purchase enough renewable electricity to meet 100% of their needs, and these are big companies like Intel, Coal, Staples, Unilever, buying a lot of energy. They're finding renewable energy, low carbon, often means low risk. So building wind and solar power capacity, it's quicker and more affordable than building nuclear or large-scale fossil plants without the associated financial, environmental, and health risks. And unlike the past, where we got a lot of our energy from a few companies, a few small players, or with our oil economy, just a small part of the world, renewable energy, it's a democratized form of energy. Anyone in the world can harness it, and they can harness it at increasingly low prices. So the choice is ours. We can look at that stormy future of climate disruption, more extreme weather events, soil erosion, deforestation, or we can decide to adopt a new strategy to make that wartime scale mobilization to make a change relatively quickly. And I would posit that this change is already happening in the energy field. So with this rapid decarbonization of our economy, there's hope to mitigate some of the damage that has already been done. And to end on a light note, in case anybody has a doubt about climate change, everything we've talked about today, all these things we can do to create energy independence or preserve forests or restore soils, they'll make a much better, brighter world for us to live in. And like the United States back in World War II, when people came together and they planted their victory gardens in their yard or saved their scrap metal, people like to have a cause. You know, saving civilization, we say, it's not a spectator sport. We all have a role in it. So think carefully. Think about what your role will be and get to work, because it's very exciting to participate in a great transition. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Sorry that Dr. Hansen didn't stay around and all that. He's into conservative money, you know, big government. He's in part of NASA and all. There is a lot of good use for fissionable materials in outer space, nuclear medicine, but not too much on the Earth. He's still sucking it up.
Oh, he'll be back. We can talk. Thank you.
Point to someone else.
Oh, over there.
We over here represent the 5G cause, where we're very concerned about the rollout. And there was some discussion about the amount of energy that it's going to take to fuel that initiative. And also yesterday I did ask the question, didn't get answered, about what about the NSA and all of the cloud and the energy that it takes to back up all of these this data. So I'd like you to speak to that. Is that something that you've looked at? And I've also said to call your representatives and tell them we don't need an NSA storing all of our data, and that would save a lot of energy. Thank you.
Thanks. I have not looked at that in depth. We have, when we looked at various sources of energy, data storage server farms are a huge draw on energy for a local community. On a global perspective, it's not, you know, they don't emit as much fossil fuels as, say, you know, cement production or construction or transportation, but it's a growing source of energy, and particularly in local communities. So, and I think so, on the one hand, it's a big energy draw. On the other hand, a lot of the tech companies are some of the biggest investors in renewable energy, and companies are excited when they do make that investment in renewable energy, because renewable energy investment is it's local energy, it's local jobs. You're not going to be offshoring solar installation. You're not going to, those jobs will stay in the country and they're good, high-paying jobs. But as for the broader point, I think it's something that's important to look at. Thank you.
My question about, you mentioned about when a government sees and we can save electricity, it's become standard. Like, for example, saving energy, refrigerator or other equipment. And my question about this saving energy light bulbs. And it's become standard right now, but I read a lot of information how dangerous they are for our health. And it's impossible right now to buy regular old-fashioned light bulb. And does anybody look at safety also, not just like about save energy? Mm-hmm. And what do you know about it? Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, so a lot of the health concerns with regard to lighting have been about the compact fluorescent lighting, which for the regular house lamps, they're the ones that are sort of little loopy tubes, and they contain a small amount of mercury in the bulbs. Each household bulb for a household lamp might contain about as much mercury as is in a common watch battery. So while you don't want to break it and handle it, you need to be careful about it. It's much smaller overall than the amount of mercury that's released into the environment from coal-fired power plants. So if we shifted all our lights to compact fluorescence, it would be less mercury potentially entering the environment than if we were to burn coal to power the inefficient incandescent light bulbs, because I think CFLs use a fraction, maybe 25% the amount of energy as the regular ones. Now, the good news is, because still any amount of mercury is concerning, right? It's a neurotoxin. You don't want to be adding that into the environment in any form. That the LED lights do not have that same problem, so you don't have to be as careful about breaking them in. And they're more energy efficient than the CFLs, and they're becoming more inexpensive. So I think if you're concerned about mercury, bypass the compact fluorescence and move to the LEDs, but feel confident that either way, by using the more efficient lights than the regular old, Edison, totally incandescent light bulb, you're still having less mercury entering the environment. I can't hear.
Sorry, I get headaches from LED, so I can't be around that, especially over my head, because she was talking about the safety of the lights, and I'm wondering what it is about the LED lights. That
I know
is
that some of the early
I find it unpleasant.
If I understand correctly, if you get headaches from LEDs, I'm not an expert in that by any means. I know the quality of light that was produced, especially by a lot of the early LEDs, was like more blue. It had higher levels in the blue end of the spectrum, and now they're better. You can get the more warm light, and you can get other lights, and it's recommended that cities switch to the other kinds because it's better for the animals in the environment. But I haven't studied the health effects very closely. I do know the technology is getting better, but I don't know specifically about the health effects.
In reference to LED lights, I can vouch, ever since I've put them in my house, throughout the house, they no longer call me eagle eye, and I'm serious. It's affected my vision, the LED light bulbs, without a doubt. They're definitely damaging to your eye, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, thank you for that comment. That's not something I'm an expert in, but your experience is your experience and it's valid, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to comment on the LEDs as well, for the person that said they can't see good anymore. There's a neurosurgeon named Jack Cruz. You can look him up online. He talks all about the LEDs and how dangerous they are. They actually screw up your metabolism. They crystallize your pineal gland. They have all kinds of endocrine gland problems because of them. And he said the best thing is to go back to the old-fashioned light bulbs. LEDs are seriously dangerous.
As my very astute sister has just mentioned, if you want to go back a little, I think it should be pretty common knowledge here that President Bush made a deal with a friend of his who was developing all these new tech light bulbs. And that's why the good ones that didn't hurt us were taken off the market. Just do your research. The story is all there.
Any other questions or comments? I'll say that I can definitely look more into that. That's not something I'm familiar with. And I think ultimately, if we do shift to a renewable economy, then it won't matter, say, how much each individual light bulb is drawing from the system. So it depends on what your ultimate goals are. I think if we continue to use the most inefficient things and continue to burn coal to perpetuate those systems, that comes with a whole slew of other health effects as well. So, but if we have a renewable energy economy, then hey, it doesn't matter so much how much energy each light bulb uses. So maybe the old ones would come back. I don't know. Thank you. Well, I think are we out of questions? I appreciate you all taking the time, and if anyone wants to chat afterwards, I will be here. Thank you.